we kind of know where David's coming from because what do we know about David before he became a king? In fact, what was David doing when he was anointed king? He was a shepherd. And so you see a lot of shepherd analogies here, and we're going to look at that. Uh, in fact, there are two major analogies that Psalm 23 covers. But we're a little bit familiar about the duties of a shepherd. You may recall not so long ago, Jason did this series on shepherding and the analogy. Shepherds is an analogy for leaders in the church, and a leader can be just about anyone who's in a situation or a position, however official or unofficial, where they're guiding other people. And it was a wonderful study. It was based on a book written by a very good guy, Lynn Anderson. And basically compared the duties of a church leader or someone in a leadership position, being a shepherd, which if you do the job correctly, it's not necessarily always a fun thing, because going into the work of a shepherd meant that you had to spend time with the sheep, and you had to think like a sheep, and you had to look out for a sheep, and sheep are kind of sheepish, for lack of a better term. Sheep sheep do many silly things. Um, and because of that, the shepherd has to kind of think like a sheep, kind of look out for the sheep, and keep the flock intact, especially in back in the day when uh, you basically the sheep grazed in a valley or in certain other areas where there were predators. There were natural predators. There were other natural dangers as well. There were places where if sheep wasn't too careful, it could slide off a cliff, maybe get into a bad spot, and had to be rescued. If there were predators like wolves or bears or even back in the day in that area, there were the occasional lion would show up. You had to, the shepherd's job was to protect the flock, fight them off. But in addition to that, there was the everyday situations that a shepherd faced. Basically, if you were going to have a good flock to sell off and make some money on your investment, you had to care for them, which meant that you had to feed them, you had to water them. To feed a flock of sheep, you had to know where all the good grass was and where there was plenty of it, because the sheep needed it. And so when is David being sacrilegious or flippant when he refers to the Lord as my shepherd? Well, no, because being a shepherd himself, he knowing what he had to do, what he had to go through, take care of his flock. It gave him a greater appreciation of what God did for his flock, because when we talk about how sheep behave, we kind of do it in a condescending way, but sheep, sometimes people are not all that different. In fact, you can kind of draw some parallels in their behavior and in our behavior. So one thing leads to another when you think about that concept, and that's very likely how David came up with what we call the 23rd Psalm, and how he becomes more and more appreciative of how God looks out for him as his personal shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. This indicates, hey, a certain degree of intimacy. God is more than just the all powerful God, which He is. He is my God. He is my Lord. He is my shepherd. That first line of verse 1, Psalm 23, is so familiar, especially for those of us who grew up reading it in the King James Version. You know how that reads, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And I remember being, what, 8 years old and reading that line, and "Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Well, if I don't want it, how come we're talking about it? Well, it's that wacky Elizabethan in the English coming at you. Uh, Gives you an idea. Wonderful lesson of how language changes through the centuries, and what made perfect sense back in the 17th century no longer does, or is very confusing. I shall not want means I shall not be lacking. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. All my needs are met. I like the way the Message paraphrase translates that line. It says, I don't need a thing. I'm taken care of. What I need to get me through the day has been met. Now, what sometimes we think is our needs are not necessarily our needs. Like, Lord, I really do need that BMW. Well, no, you really don't. But I tell you what you do need. You need enough food to get you through the day. You need water so you don't dehydrate. You need some kind of shelter. And yeah, you need transportation. We can figure out some things for you there. So yeah, even if it's the bare minimum, God is meeting your needs. But sometimes, and many times, He does more than the bare minimum, as if you think about it. Verse 2, He makes me lie down in green pastures. That's part of a shepherd's job. Basically, yeah, great pastures give the image of grass, of food, and ideally water nearby. And He makes me lie down. It's a little thing about that's the weird thing about sheep. If they're unsettled, if there's something bugging them, they are not going to lie down. You can't, they're going to keep agitating and moving around, and uh, potentially getting into some trouble spots. And anxious sheep won't settle down. Well, what will settle them down? Well, just uh, food, water. They have the basics there, and then also if they have a sense, if they have their sheep sense that, hey, this is a safe place. I'm protected. I don't have to worry about being eaten in the next 5 minutes. Um, I'm cared for, and that's a good shepherd does everything he can to build that kind of environment. Well, that's what that's what God does for us. He creates that environment for us that whatever situation we may find ourselves in, He's taking care of us. Our needs are being met. He's caring for us. We can settle down. We can lie down. We can sleep in peace. It's a lot of that has to do with our relationship with God, how the kind of faith relationship we have with God. Sometimes it means at some point we need to make a decision. We're going to be faithful, or do we choose faith over fear? Sometimes you have to do that. But it's interesting how once you choose faith, how your faith does grow and how it increases, and then your confidence in God grows. So He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. And as a result, verse 3, He refreshes my soul. He restores my soul. He guides or leads me along the right paths, along the paths of righteousness. If you're following God's prompting, you are going to be living a righteous life. And generally, a righteous life will be a blessed life, as opposed to one that kind of starts skewering off on certain trails that you really shouldn't be exploring or developing, and one thing leads to another, and you got problems. A righteous life is one it's essentially free from worry and doubt and anxiety. If you which those are the things that we've been, God says those things are sin. And in fact, Jesus says, don't worry about you know, whatever you may be worrying about. God will meet your needs. Your needs, meet your needs for the day and for the next day. Worry and fear, yeah, they're sinful. I mean, they're not sins necessarily to the extent that they separate you from God eternally, but they can separate you from God relationally, where they contribute to that feeling of fear and doubt and anxiety. And that's one thing we need to watch out for. We don't want to have that kind of relationship where we don't trust God, because God is there for us. But if we do, with that kind of, if we are living righteously, if we are being led along the paths of righteousness, we have that, the greater the chances we have that secure relationship. And God does it, yes, He does it for us, but He does it for Himself as well, because He's the kind of God who takes care of His creation. He does it for His name's sake, into verse 3. Now we get into verse 4. And if you notice, there's a change in pronouns here, because for first half of the psalm, David's been referring to God in the third person. The Lord is my shepherd. He makes me lie down. He leads me. He refreshes. He guides me. He. It's that person right there, God. But then in verse 4, the pronouns shift. Notice how now David becomes even more intimate about his relationship with God. He says, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. So he's now talking directly to God. God is the second person. It's between David and God, and David is confessing how God has helped him and continues to help him. Verse 4 is familiar because, and again, going back to the old King James, even the New King James translates it this way, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And yes, the prospect of death, any kind of existential threat that you're facing, yeah, that's scary. That's unsettling. That can really unnerve you. But maybe the way it's translated in other translations, where David is walking through the darkest valley, that may be a little bit more appropriate to describe what he's trying to describe. And in fact, here's another shepherd analogy, because as the shepherd leads his flock, guides it along, sometimes they go into these crevices and so forth, where you have these high walls, and that even on a clear day or very sunny day, even at high noon, it's going to be dark, rather shadowy. What do we know about places like that? Well, they're good places for predators, for humans and otherwise. You got to watch out. Hey, what's behind that rock? What could be around the bend? That could be a little frightening, a little scary. And we may not be facing death every day, to extend this analogy, but we, more often than we like to think, we face very serious situations, like, what are we going to do? What decision do we need to make? And the thing about being Christian is that God doesn't take us away from scary situations or troublesome situations. We face troublesome situations just like anyone else, but God is there to guide us through those situations and help us come out better. Yes. Mhm. Mhm. I'm glad you said that, because that's a very good statement to make, and there sometimes you do run into that conversation with someone who says, well, if why do Christians run into situations like that? And like you say, it's you know Christians face situations, scary, unsettling, unhappy situations, just like anyone else. But the difference is that they have God leading them through those situations if they are attentive to what God wants them to do, regardless of what that situation is. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Very personal now. It's he for someone who's saying referring to God as the Lord in the third person, he could have said, "I'll fear no evil, for the Lord is with me." Better than that, and not just the Lord, but it's my Lord is with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Another shepherd analogy as we close out verse 4. Two things, two tools of the trade for a shepherd: a rod and a staff. Kind of hard to imagine those, but so I had to Google them. Anyway, I found out the rod is not what we think of necessarily as a rod, a real long yardstick or whatever, but it's more like kind of a billy club, a cudgel, something relatively short, something you could stick in your waistband, something you could, a little heft to it, something you could use if you do find that wolf or, whatever predator that's going after one of your sheep. You just take that cudgel out and wham, uh, knock the wolf unconscious and protect them. And then the staff, of course, is what we think of as staff as it's a walking stick. Probably for a shepherd, has a little crook at the on the end, so that if it looks like a sheep is about to go over a cliff or whatever, or basically he's kind of wandering off, you can take your staff with a crook on the end and hook it around the sheep's neck and guide him back, lead him to safety. Your rod and your staff, they protect me, they take care of me, they keep me from straying off the main road into danger. They comfort me. And as we get into verse 5, we've been talking up to this point about God the shepherd. And by the way, before we go into verse 5, something I totally forgot about. David is well known as being a shepherd. I mean, that's what he was doing when he was anointed, and of course he's known for the shepherd psalm here. But the concept of God as a shepherd did not necessarily originate with David. In fact, if you go into the Old Testament, there are all sorts of verses, and I'll just even going back to Genesis and Moses. Genesis chapter 49, verse 24. Jacob refers to God as the shepherd, the rock of Israel. And then, of course, there are a couple of other Psalms that refer to God as a shepherd. Psalm 28, verse 9, where David says, "Save your people and bless your inheritance. Be their shepherd and carry them forever." Psalm 80, the writer of Psalm 80, verse 1, says, "Hear us, shepherd of Israel, you who lead Joseph like a flock." And then Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, verse 11, Solomon writes, "Words of the wise are like goads." We know what goads are. Those are the things that, those nails, those barbs that are put around oxen, basically to guide them, to prod them to where you want them to go. Words of the wise are like goads. They're collected sayings like firmly embedded nails given by one shepherd. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 11 says that God tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those who have young. And then Micah chapter 7, 14. Micah writes, "Shepherd your people with your staff, the flock of your inheritance, which lives by itself in a forest and fertile pasture lands. Let them feed in Bashan and Gilead." Last week we talked about Bashan as one of the great grazing areas that produce these fat and happy cattle. Let them feed in Bashan and Gilead, as in days long ago. So many references, so many comparisons to God as the Good Shepherd, and rightly so. But as we go into transition into verse 5, we transition to a different image of God, uh, not just as a shepherd, but as a gracious host. Verse 5, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows." God is a God of hospitality. And that means something back in the day that this was written, because what did a good host do? Well, first of all, the host offered protection for the evening, or for however long his guest was under his roof. If you were under a host roof, he took care of you in more ways than one. And in fact, even if there was any kind of bad guys going around causing trouble, one of his jobs was to make sure that you were taken care of, you were protected. But more than that, a host was very gracious and very friendly, and he took care of you. He made sure, hey, you were well taken care of. We remember the story about Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. Well, that was one thing that the host oversaw, made sure that, especially if he had a servant, that servant washed your feet. And then they would also um, anoint your head with oil. That was not just just to give you slick hair or whatever. It was a refreshing kind of oil. It smelled good, made you feel good. And it was really welcome after a long and very hard and hot journey. And then he fed you. And he fed you with something more than a box lunch. I remember, back in the day when we would have luncheon meetings at work, you would, hey, we're having their Jason's Deli is catering. Oh, well, we need to get there early because, they always our bosses ordered two kinds of sandwiches. One was turkey, and the other was ham. And always they always over ordered on the turkey. But even then, if you didn't get there in time, all the turkey ran out. And, oh, yeah, we got some sandwiches here, but, they're all ham. Well, okay. Um, the host did better than that. You didn't have to worry about running out of the preferred sandwich. In fact, it was more than a sandwich. It was a bounty. It was a feast when they fed you. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Once again, as we discussed, Christian's life is not free from trouble or bad situations. But God takes care of you, and more often than not, almost always, he takes care of you his grace overflows. You're in the house of God, sitting down, you're getting more than a box lunch or a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. You're going to be well taken care of. My cup overflows. There, as the King James says, my cup runneth over. And then wrapping it up, verse 6, surely your goodness and your mercy shall follow me. The way the verb is structured there, there's no wiggle room there. There's no, well, if maybe if things work out okay, if he's not distracted, yeah, we might have a good day, or yeah, we might get God's mercy and goodness, or if I do the right things, if I earn my way, God will show the love and mercy He owes me. No, no, no. God, being God and who God is, will take care of you. His goodness, His mercy shall follow me. It's a done deal. It's gonna happen. The because the word for love here is the standard word for God's love in the original Hebrew. It's God's hesed. You've got God as your posse, no matter where you go, no matter what you're doing in your life, not just today, but forever. I will dwell in the house of the Lord, not just for the weekend, not just for an extended stay. I don't have to pay any rent. I don't have to worry about my rent money going out. I'm a happy camper in the house of the Lord, not just today, not just tomorrow, but forever. God will take care of us. Well, we always when we go through these psalms, we've talked a little bit about, gee, where do we see Jesus in this psalm? Well, it's Jesus is throughout this psalm, especially with the discussion of of God as a shepherd. Jesus is also pictured as a shepherd. In fact, Jesus describes himself as a shepherd. John chapter 10, look at verse 11. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Won't read that total passage, but Jesus compares the good shepherd with the bad shepherd, the guy who just hires on because, hey, it's a job and I get some money, but oh gee, nobody told me about the wolves. Well, see you later. You know, uh, Jesus says, I'm not that kind of guy. I'm the good shepherd. I take care of my flock. And skipping down to verse 14, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. They know my voice. They respond to me when I call them. And there's no doubt, there's no confusion as to who I am and who they need to follow. There are other passages in the New Testament that pick up on Jesus as the Good Shepherd. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 20. The writer of Hebrews says, Now may the God of peace, who through the blood of the eternal covenant brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep. And then Peter, in his first letter in the New Testament, chapter 2, verse 25. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. And then skipping down to chapter 5, verse 4, Peter says, when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. Jesus is not only the good shepherd, he's also the wonderful, gracious host. What did Jesus tell his disciples? What does he tell us by extension? John chapter 14, verses 2 and 3. Jesus explains to his disciples why he must go away. He says, I am going to prepare a place for you. And that's what he's doing for each of us at this very moment. And one more verse here. This is from our good friend Paul, his letter to the Philippians, chapter 4, verse 19. My God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. Well, we have a few minutes. I can't let Psalms go without maybe quoting or referring your attention to 2 or 3 more Psalms that you might want to check sometime this week. Psalm 27, opening verse. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? And then skipping down to the end of the verse, end of the Psalm, verse 13, I remain confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. And then one final quotation. This is from Psalm 30, beginning with verse 4. Sing the praises of the Lord, you his faithful people. Praise his holy name. For his anger lasts only a moment, but his favor lasts a lifetime. Weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning. King James may have a more familiar translation of that passage. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. And with that, we'll put the Psalms back up on the shelf, and we'll probably come back to them, revisit them next summer. But in the meantime, we're going to go back to the New Testament, and we're going to go back to Dr. Luke. You know, we studied and we went through our journey through the book of Acts. We're going to go back, skip back a little bit earlier, and go back and see what Dr. Luke has to say in the Gospel of the same name. So, if you will, sometime this week, take a look at the first chapter of the Gospel of Luke. A lot in there. We'll look into it, and we'll begin our journey through the Gospel of Luke next Sunday, Lord willing. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of it, and have a great week. Be safe. Continue to pray for rain. The lakes are just about filled up. I think there's something like 90 or 95% full. Yay! Thank you, Lord. But be safe so that we can get settled down to our fall season and get back to our fall routine. Thank you very much.